Thank you very much, Malchin, and thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. I want to briefly, I guess it's going to be 15 minutes or maybe less, and I'll check my watch on this. What I want to do this morning is very briefly outline the historical relationship between China and Latin America, which is, for the most part, except for immigration, minimal, and then bring it up to the 20th century, particularly the mid-20th century, and talk about Chinese influence, particularly in the communist parties of Latin America, which again is relatively minimal until, of course, China becomes a communist nation in 1949. And as Malchin pointed out, the real rise of Chinese influence and trade relationships in Latin America has come about literally in the last 25 years or so. And that's been really substantial. And I want to deal with that for the most part in my latter part of my discussion. China's contact with Latin America before the 18th century was, as I said, minimal. There were some trade contacts through what was called the Manila Galleon trade, and that was during the Spanish colonial period in Latin America, but that was mostly to the west coast of Latin America, the Viceroyalty of Peru, and of course also the port cities in Panama and Central America. But for the most part, Chinese immigration to Latin America and to all the Americas was the most substantial influence that occurred. And this began in the late 1830s, 1840s, and extended all the way up to the 1870s and 1880s. This has been called the Chinese coolie trade, and I think you understand that this trade extended all over the world. Many, many, many Chinese immigrants became bonded contract laborers through contract arrangements in China. And the outflow of these immigrants was largely influenced by tremendous internal disruption in China, most particularly the Taiping Rebellion, which was one of the most costly internal wars that any nation has ever fought. Nearly 20 million, or perhaps more than 20 million Chinese died during that. Where did these Chinese go? They went everywhere. But particularly in Latin America, they went to, these were almost exclusively males. Practically no females were involved in this. And they went to Peru, they went to the Caribbean, they went particularly to Cuba, and they worked as bonded laborers, which is an interesting point of reference because there was very little difference between them and the African slaves who were working in these countries as well. Sometimes they worked side by side with African slave laborers in the sugar fields of Peru and also in Cuba. And in some cases, the labor that they were engaged in was about as bad as anybody could possibly imagine. In the Chincha Islands off of Peru, they were bonded laborers were working in what was called the guano fields, where they dug bird dung or bird guano literally for 14 hours a day, almost 7 days a week. By any standards, this was slavery, but because the termination of their contracts did come about legally after about 7 to 10 years, they were not considered to be property. This situation basically creates a Chinese population in nearly every major West Coast Latin American country. It also does in the United States. You know, they worked in the agricultural fields of the United States, West Coast and California. They worked as laborers on the transcontinental railroads. And they did the same thing in Peru. They worked on the Trans-Andean Railroad in Peru as well. But the key point to remember here is this did not create a lasting Chinese influence beyond the cities because there was no Chinese family created in Latin America for the most part because it was primarily male. So many of them settled in the cities of Latin America, and almost every major Latin American country has a Chinatown, just like the U.S. The last thing I want to mention about this is that unlike other Asian immigrants, they did not have the protection of the Chinese government. The Chinese government simply was not strong enough to try and diplomatically safeguard the rights and the, literally the livelihood, and in many cases the lives of their own Chinese citizens. I can be very frank with you, just like with the Japanese immigrants, oftentimes these people were shunted out of the country and forgotten about. And so the Chinese experience, at least as immigrants, was a relatively sad one, to say the least. You'll still see Chinese today in Lima, Peru. You'll still see in Havana, Cuba. But for the most part, these are later immigrants. They're not really the holdovers or the fourth or fifth generation of these original coolie laborers in the late 19th century. The coolie labor trade ends in the 1870s. Great Britain puts an end to it for the most part because it wasn't in their interest. And finally, international pressure against the inhumanity of it all brought it to an end. But at the same time, if you look what happened in the United States, once the Chinese had contributed substantially to the many aspects of the mining business, the railroad construction business, the United States passes the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1881 and says, we don't want any more Chinese coming into this country. That does not happen in Latin America because for the most part, the Chinese coolie trade had all but ended at that point. Okay, into the 20th century, there's minimal contact between China and Latin America. We all know, if you've taken any Chinese history, that China is convulsed in its own internal difficulties through most of the latter part of the late 19th century into the 20th century, and this really stops an outreach process. When does it begin to become dramatic? There are some attempts to create, you might say, a Chinese variant of communism in Latin America in the 1940s as Mao Zedong's movement begins to get full steam in the 1940s. But Russia, or I should say the Soviet Union, stops this for the most part. Every Latin American Communist Party which is formed in Latin America after 1920 is Soviet-based, or at least is Comintern-based. And they're the only country, the Soviet Union is the only country that can really give these communist parties, and they're very small. They might number no more than 400 or 500 in any country. They might give them their only source of income and keep them alive. And so we don't really see a Maoist or even a Trotskyite component of these in most Latin American countries. This begins to change once the Communist Party of China under Mao Zedong begins an outreach program for its communist parties everywhere in the 1960s, I guess it would be. And this comes as part of the Cultural Revolution when Mao literally wants to extend the influence of China as far afield as he possibly can. Now, I'll be very frank. Latin America is really pretty much of a very low priority as far as Mao is concerned. But if he can gain adherents, he's going to supply them with some assistance. And every time he tries to do this, or every time he makes an attempt to do this, the Soviet Union, because the Sino-Soviet split had occurred in the late 1950s and 1960s, is going to oppose him. And they have the money, and the Maoists do not. The most successful, if you want to use that term, Maoist party in all of Latin America occurred in Peru, and it was called Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path. And its leader, a man by the name of Abimael Guzman Reynoso, was a philosophy professor. You have to watch out for these professors who get a little bit, shall we say, caught up in their own sense of importance. And this fellow probably was one of the most dangerous men who ever lived in Peru. Why do I say that? Because he had a vision of the Communist Party of Peru based upon the model that he had learned while living in China during the 1960s. He was an open adherent of Mao's very radical revolutionary programs. And what made him even more of an adherent was because he saw the Soviet Union moving away from what he thought was radical revolution and becoming more oriented towards détente or better relations with the United States. So when he came back to Peru in the late 1960s and early 1970s, he began building this party, mostly in the high Sierra of Peru in the mountains. He had deep contempt for the Communist Party. And when they finally made their appearance on the streets of Lima in the early 1980s, they had a rather symbolic way of announcing their presence. They captured stray dogs and they hung them from lampposts. And the implication was, with signs on these stray dogs, dead dogs, that this is what happens to the running dog anti-imperialists of the Soviet Union. And that was a pretty typical representation of how this party thought. They then built a revolutionary movement which was not large in numbers, but was fierce in terms of its commitment to take over Peru. And I'll summarize this very quickly. Possibly they had no more than 3,000 to 4,000 fighters. But what they sought to do, of course, was to try and, as Mao had preached in his own writings, to try to gain the adherence of the peasantry in Peru. And in this, they failed miserably because they misunderstood the dynamics of the peasantry. Most of the leadership of Shining Path was urban-based intellectuals. They were not, you might say, people of the highlands. They just simply weren't. Lower-level fighters were, but not the leadership. And in the last analysis, they failed to gain the support of the peasantry. The peasantry actually defeated the Shining Path and the countryside by raising their own self-defense brigades, as they were called. They were called the Rondas Campesinas. And the Army took some credit, and the Marines took some credit for destroying some of the Maoist cells in the Sierra, in the mountains. But for the most part, it was the peasant population that did this. Then the leadership of Sendero made a major change and a major mistake, not following Mao's principles of strangling the cities from the countryside. They moved into Lima and other cities and began a terrorist bombing campaign, assassination campaign, which they thought would bring the Peruvian government to its knees. And it almost did. But through very good police work, not affiliated with the Army or any Air Force intelligence, but primarily police work, the leadership was captured, and as it was a very top-heavy organization, the entire leadership of the Metropolitan Committee in Lima was caught in one raid. Probably about 9 out of the 15 leaders of the movement was caught in one raid, and that did not decapitate Sendero as they thought it would, but literally put it into a very low mode of operation. And it's now sort of resurfaced in the central regions of Peru, but not so much as a Maoist party, but more as a narco-trafficking party, which is very, very entrenched in some of the most remote areas of Peru and really remote areas of all over the world, and it's being fed by narco-trafficking money. So Maoism to narco-trafficking. I wrote an article on this just last year, and it's a morphology, you might say, which you can also see happening in places such as Colombia with the FARC. So that should be looked at pretty carefully. Now, if you talk about any Maoist connections, they don't even want to admit to that. They just said, we made some serious mistakes in the 1980s by preying on the peasantry. We're now here to redeem ourselves, which is an interesting point of reference. So, last 2 points, real quickly. Lots and lots of Chinese investment has occurred since the 1990s, and I'll summarize it real quickly. What the Chinese want in Latin America is mineral resources, of which Latin America is very, very rich. They want copper, they want iron ore, they want oil, they want almost every aspect of the natural resource base which they need to augment for their national development. And they're getting them. They're getting copper from Chile. They've signed long-term contracts with Chile, one of the leading copper-producing countries in the world. They've done the same thing with Peru. They own about 49% of one of the leading copper companies in southern Peru, Cajone, where they're at least going to be assured very significant copper supplies for the next 15 to 20 years or so, possibly more. Natural gas in Bolivia, natural gas in Venezuela. There's been an oil strike off of, or at least an oil sounding off of Brazil, which might be as large as any oil discovery anywhere in Latin America. It's going to involve significant Chinese investment to allow the state-owned Brazilian oil company, Petrobras, to set up these platforms. And China has given Brazil a $10 billion loan against the oil shipments, which should be coming out of those offshore deposits about 50 to 60 miles off of Rio de Janeiro. Finally, what about arms shipments? Mostly the Chinese have not been able to compete with the Soviet Union, Belarus, France, Germany in arms shipments to Latin America, but there seems to be an opening which has occurred, particularly with Peru. Peru made an agreement just in the last year to purchase at least 80 to 100 Chinese, and it's a joint Chinese-Pakistan tank. It's called the Khalid in Pakistan, MBT 9000 in China. It's a very impressive battle tank, but it's a lot smaller than the battle tanks that would be sold from, say, Russia or Belarus. And what's more, it fits what the Peruvians want because it's got an interchangeable engine and an interchangeable transmission. So the parts aspect, which was always a problem with Peru, apparently will not be that big an issue because if they can't get the parts from China, which oftentimes is the case, then they can probably make some negotiations for other parts as well. This involves a commitment, as I said before, to replace Peru's outworn Soviet tank fleet, but we see possibilities of Chinese arms shipments going to Venezuela and a number of other places as well. It's going to be a tough arms market to crack, but the Chinese are looking to make some very good deals. What the Russians did in the 1970s with Peru is what the Chinese are doing now. They're selling these tanks almost at a loss, so they can break right into the arms market and assure that other aspects will follow. How do I characterize Chinese relationships with Latin America? Every major economy in Latin America is thinking that it needs to make connections with the Chinese, most particularly Brazil. Brazil and China are the two, Brazil is the major player in South America, and Brazil and China are going to become even more intimately linked economically over the course of the next 10 years. And it's not going to be an ideological thing, it'll be mostly a business operation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We're not high-tech song, goes all means time song.
I know that. I only went one more minute.
Good morning, Midshipman. From 2005 to 2007, I was the U.S. Defense Attaché to Senegal in West Africa, stationed in Dakar. And in November of 2006, the Chinese held a summit in Beijing on basically African partnership. And 45 out of 54 heads of state from sub-Saharan Africa showed up in Beijing for this Africa-China summit. Now I have to say, I doubt if the US president invited all of the heads of state from Africa to come to Washington for a summit. Honestly, I sort of doubt that 45 heads of state would show up. Heads of state, you know, they're not sending their ministers, they're not sending some sort of representative or something like that. The heads of state are coming. So why would they do that? Well, clearly they think it's in their interest to do that. Over the course of about the last 10 or 15 years, Chinese engagement with sub-Saharan Africa has gone up exponentially. And they've made no bones about the fact that they are coming to Africa for the resources. All of the building, all of the industrialization, development that's taking place in China, they've made no bones about the fact that they're getting many of those raw materials from Africa. And especially the energy resources in the Gulf of Guinea. They really view sub-Saharan Africa as sort of a frontier to which they can go and not get a lot of competition from other world powers. Because, let's face it, the United States historically has sort of viewed Africa as a backwater of US foreign policy, haven't paid a lot of attention to it. Not very much economic engagement, economic ties. Africa only represents 1% of world GDP. But the Chinese have been very clear that's what they're headed to Africa for. And you know, in some sense, I think that African leaders sort of appreciate that honesty. They probably find it more refreshing than the nature of American engagement, which is often saying that, hey, we're coming in here to help you, we're going to build a clinic, we're going to build a school, or whatever. And Africans are smart enough to know that when you say that you really care when we're really engaged in Africa, they know that if you have to say that, then that's not really true. Okay. So I just want to share with you 3 little vignettes from my time in Senegal that sort of represents the nature of this relationship. I hope they'll prove illustrative for you. In late 2005, there was a Taiwanese diplomat who went to the same church that I went to in Dakar, and he and his family packed up and left in about 2 weeks when Senegal announced that they were going to invite the Chinese back in, because the Taiwanese had been in Senegal for about 10 years. The Chinese had come in 1995 and built the soccer stadium. And this is a lot of what they do with their engagement. They'll come in and build major infrastructure. So soccer stadiums, canals, whatever the case may be. The problem is, and I think where sort of the double-edged sword is for Africans, is that the Chinese normally bring their own labor to do these projects. And because they're bringing in their own labor, they're not employing that many local Africans. They're also bringing in a number of merchants who can bring in cheap Chinese goods that sort of undercut the local merchants. And so this is kind of a double-edged sword. But the Chinese had been there in 1995, built the soccer stadium, and then the Senegalese invited the Taiwanese in. So it became one of a handful of African nations that recognized Taiwan and invited them in. So then the Chinese departed. Well, in 2005, I don't know if you remember this, but we were pretty critical of the United Nations, and there was a lot of talk about reforming the United Nations and specifically the Security Council and expanding the Security Council at the United Nations. And there was talk of having 2 African seats, permanent seats on the Security Council. The Senegalese were making a pitch to be one of those African nations. And so they invited the Chinese to come back in, and they also realized that all of their neighbors were benefiting from Chinese engagement, because the Chinese had practically blanketed the continent with their engagement. And so they invited the Chinese in. When they did that, the Taiwanese left. So they got their soccer stadium, and then they had 10 years of Taiwanese engagement, Taiwanese economic assistance. And then when it was in their interest again to make a play for one of these seats on the Security Council, they invited the Chinese in, the Taiwanese took off. So what I'm saying is that these nations are smart enough to sort of do what's in their interest, and they're very clearly doing that. The last sort of vignette I wanted to share with you, though, is actually my classmate from the class of 1990 here, a guy named Jean-Jacques Lopez. I was reunited with him in Senegal. Any international students in here? International midshipmen? Where are you from? Algeria. Algeria? Okay, great. Pardon? Tunisia? Great, great. And the Philippines? Great, great. Well, you guys may be seeing these guys down the road, okay? I'd never, to tell you the truth, I didn't know that Jean-Jacques Lopez was Senegalese. I thought he was African American. But he was Senegalese, and he was my classmate here at the Naval Academy. He was, I think, one of the first African midshipmen to come here to the Naval Academy. And Jean-Jacques had the opportunity to go to China for 3 months of training. And he told me that when he was there that their itineraries were very controlled. They stayed on the base the entire time. They were never allowed really to go out into the town. And he said that at one point, one of the Chinese instructors actually sort of apologized to him and said, you know, I would love to invite you guys over to my house and to meet my family and everything. Jean-Jacques was telling me this at a reception at my house. And but this Chinese officer told him, I would love to have you over, but we can't do that. You know, that's against our policy. The only time he was allowed off the base was on sort of a guided tour. So all that to say that, you know, the Africans want Chinese assistance, but they understand it's a double-edged sword. As I mentioned before, with the Chinese labor, and then also just I think what we have going for us, if there's any sort of competition between the Chinese and us and going on in Africa, and there's not that much, but maybe there is a little bit, is that we have the freedom to do those kinds of things. And so even from 2005 to 2007 is sort of the height of the Iraq controversy. The United States, probably more so than any other part of the world, is still relatively popular. And I think it's sort of on the basis of those relationships that we'll continue to be able to work in Africa. Thanks a lot for your attention.
So it's by alphabetical order, not by seniority.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I should. Would you like to go ahead?
It doesn't matter. You can
Go for it. I insist.
Where's the chair?
He's gone.
It's gone.
Volunteer.
That's right.
What a bunch of ethnic dragons. Is it on?
It is.
It is.
Yeah,
If you see the green light on there, it should be on.
Right.
Oh,
Okay. Okay. Feels like an opera show here. Good morning. Actually, I want to thank him for putting together this roundtable. In China, we know is on a daily basis read about China. Mostly, it's about the domestic troubles. You know, here drought, crisis, protests, and so on and so forth. It's highly preoccupied in the domestic front. It's also quite preoccupied in the region, in Asia. And but as its economy, its overall capacity has increased, and its influence and footprint and interest have expanded in other parts of the world, as Professor Masterson and Major did have illustrated in Africa and Latin America. I mean, we are all from the Naval Academy. Professor Yu introduced us as all insiders. So consider this as insider's account of China's rise. Okay. How many of us know the population of China? What's the population of China?
1.2 billion.
Not you, Professor. 1.2 billion. What? 3 billion? 5 billion? A lot. The 1.2 billion answer is the closest. If we're on a Price is Right game show, you'll get maybe a coffee mug or something. 1.3 billion. What does that mean? It means if you proportionally shrink the world of population into a village of 100, how many Chinese neighbors are you going to get? That's 22, right? Which means you're going to see a lot of Jet Li movies, Kung Fu Panda will be on a regular basis. I don't want to lecture. I mean, I really don't want to lecture on a Saturday morning. I don't believe you want to listen to a lecture on Saturday morning. I'll keep it brief. I mean, it's a very important topic. It's a big topic. I'm going to try to tackle the issue of China's influence in Asia by focusing on 4 issues. One is its relationship with great powers, established and emerging powers. Established power is U.S. Essential issue between U.S. and China in the region has to do with the fact that China is an emerging power. So you have the issue of power transition. I mean, historically, when you have a great power rising, catching up, reaching its parity with the established power, it's always rife with problems, troubles, even wars. And you add to that the fact that China is a liberal power. It's a non-democracy. That makes it very hard, as Major did illustrate this, in terms of Chinese presence in Africa. But on the other hand, you have this globalization, and bilaterally, U.S.-China trade is over $300 billion a year, and China is our largest creditor, right? Holding about $900 billion U.S. Treasury bonds. So I think Harvard professor Neil Ferguson, is he at Harvard or Yale?
He's at Harvard.
He's everywhere.
He's everywhere? Okay. He coined the term of Chimerica. He was arguing that essentially you have this super spender U.S. and super savior of China, essentially get into a marriage. And now he's predicting that that marriage is heading to a divorce, a messy one. And also transnationally, right? We need China on climate change, terrorism, financial crisis, so on and so forth. So when Hillary Clinton went to China last February, she said, U.S. China are in the same boat. So neither side is willing to rock the boat, right, too hard. And so what does this all mean for U.S.-China relationship, right? Your favorite comedian, Stephen Colbert, coined the term of frenemy, F-R-E-N-E-M-Y, to suggest, right, that China is neither an enemy nor a friend. It's a frenemy. I'm not so sure she got the mixture right, but that's about I think more or less the nature of U.S.-China relationship. Quickly on Japan, essentially you have this on a political historical front, very cold, very frigid relationship, right? But on the economic front, you have very hot economic ties, economic interaction going on. And China is now the largest trading partner for Japan, the largest export market for Japan. On India, the emerging power, right? They have this historical war issue, 1962, which the fall, and India certainly remember that very vividly, and that has colored, influenced significantly how India viewed China. And you also have this border dispute, right? And also Tibetan issue. And today they have about 125,000 square kilometers contested region areas along the border of China and India. But as Professor Masterson said earlier, both countries are emerging powers, right? Goldman Sachs, Jim O'Neill coined the term about 10 years ago, a BRIC. Have you heard of the concept of BRIC? B-R-I-C. It's a shorthand for the emerging powers, right? BRIC, B is the Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So they are also collaborating on many fronts. On Russia, they formed a strategic partnership since 1992, China and Russia, and that has since muted a lot of problems they have and actually helped solve a lot of problems, including border dispute. We're talking about 43,000 long, 1,000 kilometers long border dispute has been resolved. And Russia is the largest supplier of Chinese military hardware, and now energy ties has been strengthened. Just last year, through a loan for oil program that essentially the Chinese would lend the Russian oil companies $25 billion to secure a priority access to Far East Siberian oil and oil pipeline supply through the oil pipeline supply to China. So, and that was this China's relationship with established and emerging powers. And let me get to the other big issue. That is the economic influence China has in the region. I mean, overall, on a daily basis, really we cannot live without goods made in China, right? If you're Walmart shoppers, I mean, you know what you should know what I'm saying, right? What that illustrates is essentially the fact that with globalization, what you have is a regionalization of production network in the region. Essentially, made in China means assembled in China. China is the final destination, the workshop where all the goods, intermediate goods from Japan, from Korea, from other East Asia are shipped and put together, and you put it label made in China and shipped to the US and make Walmart shoppers happy. And that contribute to this boon in terms of China's trade with all these regional countries. I have the number for 08, for example, U.S.-China trade, right? 08, $332 billion. With Japan, $267 billion. With South Korea, $170 billion. With Southeast Asia, $230 billion. With Taiwan, over $100 billion bilateral trade. And with that kind of economic power, so China essentially has become now the new engine, the new de facto leader for the latest round of regional economic integration, financial cooperation in the region, right? And that has become the new force driving regional transformation, both economically and security-wise. Now, the third issue, China's role in the major security crisis in the region. Let me focus on two: the North Korean nuclear crisis, right? China has been the host and actually a major kind of facilitator of the six-party talks. Essentially, the only diplomatic process trying to find a solution to denuclearize North Korea, right? And starting in 2003, and now rounds and rounds of six-party talks have been held. No concrete achievement has been made, but that's the only diplomatic process we have, and that's the only kind of solution that seems to be on the table. And the issue of Taiwan, that is a hard one. And China is a party to that, right? That crisis. The U.S. policy essentially is one China policy. What does that mean is, we have this three communique essentially promising China we don't want to support our independence. We do not have a Taiwan-China policy. We have one China policy. But we also have the Taiwan Relations Act, which essentially, again, commit the United States to the security, kind of security commitment, responsibility, and some kind of obligation to sell Taiwan weapons of defensive nature. So that comes down to the one U.S., one China. That really comes down to how you maintain the kind of status quo. Then what could possibly disrupt and change the status quo? Who could possibly disrupt and change the status quo? China, right? And possibly Taiwan. So what essentially U.S. policy comes down to is that opposition to either side of the Taiwan Strait, changing the status quo unilaterally. So what we have is a precarious status quo, but ultimately manageable if we do it right. I'm going to conclude with brief remarks. We started with with China-U.S. I'm going to conclude with how regional states view the United States' role in the age of rising China. If you can visualize the map, the Chinese neighborhood in the region, right? It's a very complicated neighborhood. It's a tough neighborhood, right? Look at Chinese neighbors, right? From northeast, you have North Korea, yeah? And then Japan, then you have Russia, you have Kyrgyzstan, all these big stands, Afghanistan, right? Pakistan, India, Vietnam, Southeast Asian countries. But those countries generally wanted to take advantage of the opportunities, particularly the economic opportunities that the rise of China could possibly offer. On the other hand, they don't feel comfortable living under the shadow of the great power, right? They tried that, hundreds of years ago. So on the one hand, they want to take advantage of the opportunities that China's rise offers. On the other hand, they want to hedge against the potential China threat. They want to keep China's power balanced, constrained, and limited. And which power can possibly do that? Only the United States can do it. So the irony, I think the good news about U.S. role in the region is that as power seems to be shifting to Asia, U.S. role is even more needed, is even more appreciated. I guess I'll end here.
Am I next?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming on Saturday morning. We'll try our best. When I accepted this invitation, I made it very clear I'm going to talk about Central Europe, not Eastern Europe and China. And let me quickly explain what I mean by Central Europe. Really, the concept appeared, first of all, just about the end of Napoleonic Wars, where primarily Germans decide to argue that traditional division of Europe, which is North and South, there is another segment of Europe in Northern Europe, and they call it Mitteleuropa, or Central Europe. What it really is an area of overlapping German influence, perhaps to some extent politically Russian influence. So area of, once again, German influence and Western Slavs, as well as Hungary, which obviously is not a Slavic state. It is also an area politically where Germans and Russians experience either collision or collusion, or to be a little bit straightforward, either they fight or make love. And whatever they do, they cause a lot of damage around. You can look at the Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement as an example of it. It's an area of a mosaic of nations of various origins and so on. In the very broad sense, it's from Finland all the way down to Greece. In the very narrow sense, which is being used right now, it's an area of the so-called Visegrad Treaty. That's the reference to the treaty first signed in 1364 between then Hungary, Poland, and Bohemia. So it includes the fact of 4 countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. Another way of looking at it, it's the periphery of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire never reached there, but you could feel the impact of the empire culturally and so on. It is also an area which likes to portray itself as a victim of the Yalta Agreement in 1944, the division of Europe between American and Russian sphere of influence. It is to say, when China declared a communist system in October 1944, the Central Europe was already well under Soviet Russian control, and experienced at that time the Stalinist form of communism, that is to say the so-called Muscovites, mostly people imported from Moscow, were in charge in these countries. By the way, many of them just could not speak the local languages. And when China declared to be a communist power, within 6 days or so, all of them supported communist China. That is to say, they started one China policy long before any other part of the world. So very recently, these countries celebrated 60 years of modern relations with modern China. And that 60 years, by the way, I'm in the political science department, but I'm a closet historian, that 60 years can be roughly divided into two periods. The first 40 years, 48 and 89, which is primarily a political relations, and then from 89 till present, primarily, not exclusively, economic relations. So once again, when China declared to be a communist country, the Stalinists were in power in Central Europe, and it was not a reason really for very much happiness, because it looked like communist system is really prevailing, not only in Russia, in Europe, but also in Asia. Korean War was not very welcome in that part of the world. Those people already knew in early 50s that Korean War was a beginning to the global war. It was to be a great diversion of American resources into Asia, so Russians could have an upper hand in Europe. And the region altogether, despite Yalta, has always been very strongly pro-American. Another thing was Chinese version of communism, Maoism. Honestly, there is no understanding of that form of communism among the Central European countries. They look at it as an alternative to Russian communism, but probably even worse than Russian communism. And there are simply no cultural elements in Central Europe to fully understand what Maoism was about. Things changed in 1956, that is following the revolts in Poland and in Hungary. Central Europe, which was kind of a monolithic communist system prevailed there, Central Europe became divided into a number of different, still communist countries. And first of all, there were nationalistic communist countries, countries where nationalism kind of prevailed over communism, or communist terminology was used to express nationalistic preferences. So these were Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. Actually, Yugoslavia became a nationalistic communist country in 1948. They went by the label National Road to Socialism. So we all go to the same heaven, but each one would take a different path. And there were two types of neo-Stalinist countries. The neo-Stalinist countries which became somewhat independent from Moscow, especially Romania and Albania, and they looked to China very closely because China gave them legitimacy of being communists, being more radical than Moscow. Remember, Khrushchev started something called de-Stalinization. And there were also nationalist countries, neo-Stalinist countries, but they were very firmly pro-Russian, especially Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and above all, East Germany. So that split among the Central European countries resulted that each group would have somewhat different attitude toward China. China was then seen as a counterbalance to Russia. And that's why it became a somewhat important factor in the politics of these countries. By the way, that was the time when I was a student, and I remember all of a sudden Polish-Chinese friendship societies appear here and there. And you could travel to China for much less than you could travel to the next major city in the country. Another pleasant development were Chinese restaurants. Not that those people are very hungry for Chinese food, but you could see a map of Asia with the Polish-Chinese border on it, or Romanian-Chinese border, and it was it kind of whet your appetite, let me put it this way. There was also a tremendous proliferation of jokes. These jokes obviously were anti-Russian with Chinese elements to it. Like people try to express wish to be invaded by China. Well, you know which way they would have to walk. Also, a lot of symbolic gestures were fairly popular among these countries. It was fairly well known that in Poland and in Romania, every time a Russian delegation was landing, there was another plane taking off with the local delegation to China, just to stick it to the Russians a little bit. Also, you could find a lot of books on China, study Chinese history. The Chinese language became available in various universities and so on. And also the country became inundated with Chinese students. I mean, you could see them all over, everywhere, teaching, learning native languages, etc. It was a little bit puzzling, but it really looked nice. Also, please remember that from 1955, I'm not sure, and I didn't check, I think till 1965, there were major Chinese-American talks conducted in Warsaw. And these were funny talks, because Chinese were talking to Americans, but they really wanted to make sure that Russians listen. And Americans did the same, talking to Chinese, but really the message was to Russians. But it was somewhat a recognition of the relative importance of the region. Another major event was 1968. That was a Chinese border confrontation, Chinese-Russian-Soviet border confrontations. And people were watching very carefully, how is it going to work out? What is going to be the outcome of it? Well, unfortunately, it looked like Russians at that time had an upper hand. At the same time, the great leap forward, cultural revolution in China, these were things completely beyond comprehension among these people. Why would you destroy your own country this way? The very important year was 1975, and hardly anybody really knows about this. In 1975, Warsaw Pact was to be renewed, because it was signed in 1955 for 20 years. So it had to be renegotiated. Original Warsaw Pact provided that Soviet Union would protect countries of Central Europe against external invasion, means against the Germans. In 1975, Russians demanded that it would be a kind of two-way street, that Central European countries would also provide protection for Soviet Union. What it means, if there is a conflict between the Soviet Union and China, Central European countries would have to participate in it. Without exception, even the most loyal pro-Russian people like in East Germany say, we love you Russians, but we are not going to fight China on your behalf. And the Warsaw Pact never included a provision that would obligate Central European countries to protect Soviet Union. From that time on, for the next 10 years or so, really relations between China and Central European states did not have anything significant to it. With one exception, Chinese start looking at Central Europe as a source of bad ideas. Because what was happening in Central European region, those people were interested how to end the communist rules. For that reason, the examples coming from Central Europe were really dangerous to the Chinese leadership. Central European countries were looking for Western Europe as an example, establish economic, also they had very extensive economic relations with Western Europe. China was not really an issue anymore. I think that Chinese at the same time took notice of what was going on in Central Europe in terms of instability and danger for the Communist Party, and the instability coming from economic performance of communism. Also took notice of perestroika, which was a complete economic failure, and eventually established the model, which was very anti-Marxist in itself, that you have superstructure and economic base would not really match each other. There would be one party system, and you will have capitalists to pay for it. Something which Russians never did, especially Gorbachev. He had a chance of introducing something like new economic policy, what Lenin did in 1922, which put Russia on its feet right away. Perestroika was pretty much nothing. I think there has to be some relationship between 1989 Tiananmen Square event and Central Europe. Chinese wanted to prevent something what was happening in Berlin, in Warsaw, in Prague, in Budapest. That is where people revolt and there is political change. So I would like to conclude at the end of this first 40 years period. In a sense, Central Europe was never very important to China, but it was a danger that the wrong ideas could come to Chinese people, that you can revolt and change political system. And at the same time, for Central Europeans, China was not really particularly relevant. Then the system changed in Europe, more or less in 1989. Central European countries were no longer communists, Russia no longer under communist rule. The focus of Central European countries was once again membership in European Union and membership in NATO. But very quickly they notice even if they don't know about this, they have economic relations with China. And China became an economic rival in a very interesting way, not a direct economic rival, but indirect economic rival. That is to say, West European companies would purchase Chinese goods and then send them to Central Europe with much lower price. And for a long time, it continued that way for almost 10 years. So once again, China became a direct economic rival for Central European countries, and at the same time they could not change the situation very easily because those goods were coming from France, from Germany, from Italy, and so on. And for that reason, at the end of 1990s, these countries decided to establish direct economic relations with China. So instead of those goods sneaking from the West, that they would have direct relations with China. And how they started? They imposed 60% duty on Chinese goods and products. At the same time, I would like to add, Chinese goods in that part of the world don't have cultural appeal. If it is Japanese, especially if it is German, everybody would go for it without question. If it is from China, there is simply an element of doubt and so on. However, still, they were selling in this part of the world. The situation changed drastically in 2004 when Central European countries joined European Union. Then they could not set their own rules, but they had to go by rules of European Union. What it meant that the 60% duty on Chinese products no longer applied. The consequence of it was pretty bad. In Poland alone, 200,000 jobs were lost pretty much overnight. In Czech Republic, something like 50,000 jobs and so on. So it really had a major impact. Then China joined Warsaw Treaty, excuse me, that's the old, World Treaty Organization, WTO, in 2005. So consequently, both sides kind of became restrained in what they can do bilaterally. And that motivated these countries to enter into direct economic agreements with China. And this has happened in the last 2 or 3 years. In terms of economy, the trade imbalance, I just look for very few numbers. In 2009, Polish export to China was 1.1 billion. Chinese directly exported to Poland $11 billion. Chinese investments in Central Europe are relatively small. Japan and Germany obviously dominate. That once again motivated these countries to return to the negotiating table directly with Chinese. And they have in the last few years signed a number of friendship and cooperation treaties, very interesting treaties. I actually look at 2 of them. It's an interesting treaty because each side is talking about something else. What do Chinese want? They emphasize good, stable relations regardless of differences in social systems. So let's don't stick it to us that you do this and so on. They emphasize mutual respect, mutual non-interference into domestic affairs. It's repeated almost in every sentence. So they don't want people from Central Europe to come to China and lecture them on national self-determination, on minority rights, on human rights, on death penalty, etc. That's what Chinese don't want to hear. Always the emphasis on one China policy. By the way, once again, those nations have a long legacy of 60 years following one China policy, as well as statement that unification of China is Chinese internal affairs. It's none of anybody's business. What do Central European countries are looking for? Access to a Chinese market, especially access to the major projects in China, like the Three Gorges project, that Central European companies would be able to enter Chinese markets. So that is to say, Chinese have political interests. They want to make sure that no one in Central Europe is complaining about Chinese domestic system. And Central European countries obviously have economic interests. Well, you may ask yourself a question, how important is Central Europe for Chinese? Really not very important, obviously. However, there is an element of it. These countries, right, Central European countries, are members of European Union. It gives them influence on decisions of European unions. And just please understand that the so-called Visegrad countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, have equal number of votes in European Union than France and Germany combined. Because these countries in principle are Eurosceptic, they are very often supported by Great Britain and as well as Spain. So it gives them quite a lot of leverage within European Union. And this is what Chinese want to make sure that this not go in any way that would be detrimental to Chinese interests. I also found out, and I don't know the content of the treaty, that very recently, we're talking about a month ago or so, Poland and China signed a military cooperation treaty. What it means, I am not sure. It's talking about cooperation in medicine, in training, in peacekeeping. To conclude, there are relations between Central Europe and China, but these relations for the last 60 years were really a sideshow. For the 40 years, it was a sideshow of Chinese-Russian relations. Right now, it is a sideshow of the Chinese relations with European unions. I would like to end with the comment, generally speaking, nations of Central Europe are quite apprehensive about China rising. They like United States, they like the international order, which is dominated by United States, and for that reason they fear any kind of cooperations between Russia and China. They fear that China may try to undermine international order as we know right now, and what would be the consequence of that for Central Europe, no one can predict. It is quite common in Central Europe to say that perhaps China can displace United States in one way or another, but could never replace United States. And for that reason, there is always an element of fear in the attitude of Central Europeans toward China. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Rockwall, for covering many of the points, and for Professor Deng and Major Dietz and Professor Masterson that I would like to talk about. So it's actually great to come last, because it's sort of all the things I wanted to say were already said. But I just want to add to things. I also want to say that I'm sort of a closet political scientist, being a historian. So you know, switch it around there. Yeah. I wanted to talk in that vein about the Chinese. Not perhaps displacing the United States or even replacing, but certainly establishing a presence. Everyone's familiar with the great narrative of the Somali pirate story of the American Navy, et cetera. What people may not be so aware of or so thinking about is the Chinese inserting themselves in the Somali anti-piracy world there in that whole naval operation. And in the context of that, in late March, March 28th, 29th, The first refueling and supply visit of a Chinese naval ship took place in the UAE. Everyone's heard of the UAE and the Persian Gulf in Dubai. This is the first formal Chinese naval refueling visit in modern history to the Persian Gulf. This occurred on March the 28th of 2010. So this is very much what's happening at the moment. Again, let's go and think about what are the Chinese worried about. And this goes to, I think, what Major Dietz has talked about, Professor Massett, Professor Dung, Professor Rockwell. They're worried about the resource issues with the Middle East. Primarily, oil is, of course, a primary concern. China's oil consumption is estimated to grow from 8 million to 16 million barrels a day by 2030, so in 20 years. If current trends continue, Persian Gulf oil will supply 35% of China's consumption in 2030. That is to say, 20 years from today, 35% of Chinese oil demand will come from the Persian Gulf. This alone is a figure that suggests that it's going to be important for the Chinese. The Chinese also have announced their intention and their desire to build an interstate freeway system better than the United States' freeway system. It'll be interesting to see what that means. And in the world of green stuff and global warming and all that, what that all means, I have no idea. But the Middle East, just by virtue of its energy resources, is going to be very important. I'll come to that as the very last thing I say. There's a lot of concern, too, about the United States and its role in the Persian Gulf. The United States is one of the guarantors of safety, security, stability, economic stability in the Persian Gulf. The Chinese, I think, would like to insert themselves into that discussion in the Persian Gulf in a way that people aren't certain what that's going to mean. The other key point about the Middle East is it's the pathway and it's the transit way, the waterways of the Middle East to Europe. Now, fascinatingly, for the Chinese, it's the reverse of what happens in the 19th century. In the 19th century, it's the British and the French and the Germans, the European powers, trying to secure their routes to the east. Now, curiously enough, you have China's trade with Europe, which we were talking about just with Professor Rockwell, going through, guess where? The Suez Canal. By, guess where? The place called Yemen. Everyone's heard of Yemen with all the stuff going on there right now. Europe is now China's largest export market. It's actually surpassed the United States in terms of goods, apparently, just this last year for export. China also is the largest export market to the Middle East, having overtaken Germany, the UK, and the US, about $60 billion worth of goods to the Middle East, mainly clothing and electronics, but now more and more industrial equipment. Another key point about that is the Chinese trading connections. How many Chinese are living in Dubai now? Something like 200,000. 200,000 Chinese people in Dubai. What do they want to do in Dubai? They want to make money. Okay, and that's coming back to the point Professor Masterson said. They're there for economic interest, very profoundly. And then this brings us to the next point, the question of Islam. Now, I'm sure that you've heard and you may know that there's a group in China called the Hui, who are the Chinese Muslims. There's about 15 million of those people, which sounds like a lot until you start stacking up the 1.2 billion figure. 1.3, whatever, rounding errors or whatever, but it's, not a huge thing. And of course, there are important non-Chinese Muslim minorities in Western China, in Xinjiang, which we've seen talked about in the news recently. And I'll come back to those, but again, I think that the Islam factor in China, I don't think it's as important for the Chinese. And I think another good example of that is the Chinese view of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Everyone's heard about the conflict between the Arabs and Israel and all the discussion of the Holy Land and Jerusalem, etc. The Chinese want to do business with guess who? The Israelis and the Arabs and the Iranians. They want to do and they don't want those people to blow each other up so they can do business with all of them, is the point. And so that'll be interesting to see how those pressures apply and kind of connect. Iran is a good example of all that. In Iran, the Chinese, of course, have been shipping military parts of them. There's a lot of discussion about all the different trade that's taken place with Iran. Does China favor a nuclear Iran? China's been playing a game of complex dances with the UN in terms of sanctions about this. But I think, in a sense, China wants Iran not to launch wars with other people in the Middle East that they could trade with, but it also wants to have the Iranians not simply fall into what it sees as the United States exercising too much power in the region. So it's a very, very complex set of things going on. You know, to kind of close it out, the key is resources. The Chinese have built a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline from Turkmenistan. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Turkmenistan. It's on the Caspian Sea, part of the former Soviet Union, now one of the Stans, recently under the command of a very strange and bizarre and terrifying dictator who's now passed away. So we forget about that. But Turkmenbashi was the famous dictator. But December 2009, a new natural gas pipeline from Turkmenistan through Uzbekistan, through Kazakhstan to China. Not, interestingly enough, through Kyrgyzstan. Has everyone heard of Kyrgyzstan? This is where the recent coup took place. There's sort of a little couplet last week. We're not sure what happened. The president it's complicated. But the point is, they didn't bother with his people. But this is, I think, the beginning of the Chinese vision of bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger pipelines, transit. Another key feature. How many people have thought about the Chinese piece of the Afghanistan puzzle? Probably, how many people, let's see a show of hands. How many people have thought about the Chinese, the integral Chinese part of the Afghan? Okay, a few little hands out there, a few little hands. What is it the Chinese want in Afghanistan and have signed a billions of dollars agreement to get? Does anyone know? Copper, who said that? Oh, touchdown, A+ on that one. Now, copper, much like what they're doing in Central America, there's a thing called the Ainak copper mine south of Kabul, north of Kandahar, where all the Taliban are. The Chinese have a billions of dollars investment in creating this copper mine there. So the point is the resource issue is paramount in their minds, but they also want to avoid having their prerogatives disturbed by these larger powers, such as the United States. And I think that's kind of where I would leave it in China and the Middle East. That's, what I said really was piggybacking on I think the fine words of all my colleagues. But it's you know, the Chinese are asserting themselves to a degree, but only to the degree necessary, frankly, to make some money. I think is sort of, I don't believe the other thing is that the Chinese don't have a religious stake in the Middle East. They really deeply, profoundly do not. And I think from the point of view of the Middle Easterners I know, that's actually a very positive thing. They're kind of like, well, we can go to China and we don't have to deal with any of that. It's a very kind of neutral, it's seen as neutral. So quite interesting. Okay, so that's my thoughts.
Briefly, yes.
Yeah, the question basically is, where do you see the future of China in Afghanistan vis-a-vis the United States with their pullout in July, and what's going to happen Chinese strategic-wise in terms of this pullout, basically, and in the Central Asian region. I think, again, it comes to the heart of the dilemma. The Chinese don't really want to take over the American mantle in terms of being a world force of global security presence. They really don't. And they also don't really have the resources. It's not really within their interests, within their national scope of activity. So I think that the Chinese would like to see others continue to facilitate, namely the United States, continue to facilitate peace and stability, increase peace and stability in Afghanistan and in the whole region as a kind of rising tide so that their boat, we're going to use naval metaphors here, is going to be lifted. I just frankly don't, I see the Chinese avoiding at all costs, and I repeat this, at all costs, any kind of ground, dare I say the word, troop involvement in, say, Afghanistan. I think that would be just completely against anything that they would possibly want to be involved with. I guess the flip side of all that, though, is the Chinese are prepared to engage in a fairly massive investment campaign in Afghanistan, which is going to have a huge impact on the economic future of Afghanistan, given that people like ourselves, the United States, is going to take the security charge and is going to take responsibility for the security. So I think that's going to have to be something that's negotiated out, but I think that the Chinese are kind of hoping that we will, we have this firm pull-out date, but that can be kind of adjusted, let's say, for their interests and for our interests and for the Afghan interests too. President Karzai, one last point, he is also a businessman in his own right. He's looking to do business with the Chinese, and I think that he's going to obviously channel the business that he initiates with them to his own people. But I think that he has enough networks. I think that that's going to be one of the pipelines where the Chinese commercial presence can provide benefit for Afghanistan, just in terms of lifting the per capita income, GDP, things like that. So defer to my colleagues if they have any other comments they'd like to add about Afghanistan. So yeah, Central Asia, not Central Europe. So, okay. Thank you.
So North Korea is a nuclear threat, right? And China is an economic threat. Which one is the greater threat to the United States, and what's the relationship between the two, North Korea and China? Clearly North Korea nuclear proliferation poses a great threat to the region and to U.S. interest in the region. And but as I said in the opening remarks, that China actually played this post and trying to find a diplomatic solution to the denuclearization, to denuclearize North Korea. So China, in this case, at least now, is part of the solution. Certainly, we're trying to enlist Chinese role of support in getting North Korea to denuclearize, and China clearly has a lot of leverage over North Korea. Clearly, the only power that's probably has the greatest economic ties, energy ties that North Korea depends upon for its own survival. So we need China to get on board and in order to find a diplomatic solution, and China has been doing that, but not to the fullest extent. Okay, so that's kind of work in progress. On China's economic threat, again, it's much more complicated picture, right? To some extent, again, China is the largest creditor to the U.S., holding close to $800 billion U.S. Treasury bonds. That could potentially give China a lot of diplomatic leverage on a whole host of issues. But again, to what extent that leverage can be used to achieve its own foreign policy goals is doubtful. It's still very much in doubt. Part of it is, again, the mutually interdependent nature of this. With the economic globalization, what you have is a kind of mutually assured destruction on the financial economic front, right? If China decided to sell, to get rid of the trade dollar, driving U.S. dollar down, what's going to happen to, again, the U.S. market? What's going to happen to the Chinese currency reserve, close to now $2.45 trillion, all denominated in U.S. dollars, right? And that's because the Chinese currency is still not international reserve currency, and so they have to accumulate all these U.S. dollar assets. And so, in an economic sense, we are, both countries, U.S. and China, are indeed in the same boat. And so they have to find a way to get through this stormy, especially financial crisis. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, the Treasury Department has postponed to labeling China as a currency manipulator, which automatically would require very steep tariffs on any Chinese goods coming to the U.S. Because, again, in next month, there will be U.S.-China strategic economic security, strategic dialogue. I think 3 years ago, the Naval Academy, we actually hosted one of those U.S.-China economic security dialogues. So that indication of, again, the mutually interdependent nature of the economy and the need for both countries actually to work together in dealing with all these economic issues, right? And fundamentally today, we face a problem of unbalanced development. That China has saved too much, U.S. has consumed too much. And in order to address this global financial imbalance, the Chinese have to consume more, and we have to cut down our own spending, right? Okay. That's all I have to say.
The question was, there seems to be a division within the party leadership, particularly between the civilian and military leadership in China. And how would that affect China's overall ambition if there is such a coordinated effort to go overseas to repeat the 1400s world tour? So when Michael Jackson saying "We Are the World" has different meaning, when China say "We Are the World" has different feel to it. That's an excellent question because if you study Chinese politics, as President Deng also is an expert on this, and there is absolutely a insistence on the party control of the military, and that control is absolute. There's absolutely no deviation from that at all. This actually, this adamantly on this thing, it reflects many things. One is that the importance of the army to the regime. Secondly, obviously, the profound insecurity of any such division within the top leadership, that somehow the army might take its own way. And if you look at the promotion of senior generals, senior military leadership in China, 7 out of 10 of those kind of people who promoted to the senior general level are political commissars rather than professional military commanders. So we're talking about the Soviet-style military structure is pretty much in place in China. That is the absolute insistence on ideological indoctrination and party control. And I was, by chance, involved in our Naval Academy's exchange effort to establish the exchange program with Chinese Naval Academy. And I went with a delegation. And it's almost impossible because their way of training midshipmen were completely different from ours. Their way of training midshipmen is that every midshipman unit is controlled by 2 fundamental elements. One is the party sale among midshipmen. Every dormitory is 1 or 2 party leaders, and therefore the core. And then for youngsters and plebes, which will be your equivalent, will be controlled by the sales of the Communist Youth League. And they'll spend an enormous amount of time studying party directives and Marxism and Leninism on the importance of army in supporting the regime. So it's very important. The difficulty lies, of course, here. If we send our midshipmen as exchange students to their Chinese military naval academy, you will be housed separately in a different building. You will not eat and study with their midshipmen because you totally will not mingle with them. So that's not exchange. Okay, so that's basically, it shows you how different it is. On the other hand, though, there's a profound irony here. Chinese, one of the most important things about China's influence in the world has something to do with this rapid professionalization of its army. From weapons equipment in the last several decades, China has spent an enormous amount of money and energy focusing on modernizing Chinese military. In 1979, China fought a war with Vietnam, invaded Vietnam. It shows how inadequate Chinese military was. So from that moment on, China decided to modernize. And they have the model to emulate, that is the United States military. So they watch everything that we do. If you go to China, talk to any military person or even Chinese college students, they know a lot more about our weapon system, our military system, than you do. And seriously, because this is the goal to catch. So that's very important. The irony here is that the more professionalized an army has become, the less politically inclined. And that's China's worry. Leadership is very, very worried about that sort of thing, from top down. And so that's a challenge, I think. That's a challenge. That's why to develop a military-to-military exchange program with Chinese professional military personnel is of utmost importance. And that's very hard to do so far, but we'll keep doing that. But that's basically it, in a very indirect way, answer your question. But I think that's what's China's reality. The fact that China has to spend a lot of time to rein in its party, to this army, is going to impede its global ambition. The other aspect of that is very obvious, because China is such a big country, and with a lot of things going on, and the domestic situation is not very stable. So the Chinese army, that they call the People's Liberation Army, is not 100% national defense force as you are, as we are. Chinese military, PLA, is essentially an internal security force. And they have so much to do within the domestic front than defend the nation. So much part of that task is going to impede China's going abroad. So that's a very good question, but it's very difficult to answer. You have to study the China whole thing. That's why you should sign up to Professor Ben's class and my class.
Miles?
Yeah.
Professor, you said that the Chinese are paying attention to what we're doing. I sort of have a personal story about that. The only time I sort of got myself into hot water in the job in Senegal was actually in Guinea-Bissau. As the defense attaché to Senegal, I was also diplomatically accredited to 3 nations to the south of Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde. Well, Cape Verde is to the west. But anyway, so on one of my visits, usually about once a quarter, I tried to get out to these other countries to visit these other countries and the embassies there. However, we closed down our embassy in Guinea-Bissau in 1998 because of the civil war there. And after meeting with the Bissau-Guinean Navy Chief of Staff, I walked out of his office and was sort of ambushed by these reporters and asked what the significance of this visit was. What did it mean for the future of American and Bissau-Guinean relations? And I said essentially that if we continue to see progress in the security sector reform process in Guinea-Bissau, which is part of the reason for the Civil War in 1998. Most recently, last year, the Armed Forces Chief of Staff was assassinated. This is a guy that I used to meet with down there. And then the next day, the president was assassinated. So they have this long history of some very serious problems between the military and the civilian sector there. In fact, the military is the problem in many ways. But I said if we continue to see progress in the security sector reform process, then Bissau-Guineans could expect more American engagement. We were already doing some things in the country with humanitarian demining and things like that. But basically the next day I got a call to call back to the embassy in Senegal because I was speaking in English and it was going on television, Portuguese, being translated into Portuguese, and it basically said that the United States was planning to reopen its embassy in Guinea-Bissau. That's not what I said, but that's basically the way it got translated. And then so in addition to this television thing, the thing that really got the attention of the embassy and of the folks in the State Department back here in Washington was an internet piece published by the Xinhua news agency, essentially quoting me saying these same things. So just to sort of add a personal vignette about are they paying attention to what we're doing? Yeah, and we're paying attention to what they're doing as well. Any other questions?
So I know one of the big issues we have with China is their currency controls right now, and I think that's an issue that's going to be coming up. What do you think would happen if they were to loosen or release their currency controls? How would that affect European and like U.S. markets with China, and how would that like affect how they do what they
Okay,
do?
the question is, what would happen if China loosens its currency controls? And I'm going to quickly hand the microphone to Professor Ding for this one.
So I have to pretend I'm an economist. Essentially, the currency issue has to do with the fact that Chinese currency is pegged to U.S. dollar, so it's not subject to the market, free market fluctuation. Right? The money essentially is like goods, right? You go to the counter, you use dollar to buy Chinese yuan, or use Chinese yuan to buy U.S. dollars. That's what the exchange rate is about. So again, like goods are subject to market supply and demand. The issue has to do, again, the currency issue with Chinese currency has to do with the fact that, again, the Chinese currency is basically pegged to the U.S. That is a fixed value. But not totally. It was fixed for about a decade, from 1994 to 05. That is U.S. currency, U.S. dollar, Chinese RMB traded at a fixed value, about 8 yuan or so. But 04, they did introduce a more flexible system, essentially tighter currency to what they call the basket currency, not just U.S. dollar, but Japanese yen, euro, won, different currencies. And so the result was that during this 3-year time frame, the Chinese currency actually did appreciate for about 21%, from 05 to 08. But since 08, they basically decided to go back to this more fixed system. So what you have seen so far, since 05, was very little kind of fluctuation fixed, while U.S. dollars have been, again, appreciated vis-a-vis other currencies like euro or Japanese yen. So you would think, by market logic, that the Chinese currency would also kind of appreciate in terms of the value vis-a-vis U.S. dollar. But it has not happened. So that's what the problem is. Now, the impact on U.S. is fundamentally causes, as I said earlier, about the imbalance between the two economies, right? The Chinese saving too much, or we spend too much. And to address that, essentially currency appreciation should be part of the picture. If the Chinese currency rises a little bit over vis-a-vis U.S. dollars, that means the Chinese consumers will be able to afford U.S. goods more, and we could export more to the Chinese consumers, right? And the Chinese goods will be, Chinese-made goods will be more expensive to all these Walmart shoppers here. But the issue is, right, even economists have difficulties in figuring out, again, how much the Chinese currency is undervalued, and what should we do about it? Would this really provide the magic bullet solution to this problem of economic imbalance? So that's why the Treasury Department has decided to postpone labeling China a currency manipulator. It was supposed to be released actual report earlier this month, and the Treasury Department decided to postpone this. And I'm sure this issue will be brought up in the next round of economic and strategic dialogue between the countries to be held in Beijing next month. My sense is that the Chinese will make some concession on this issue, and we're going to see a little bit Chinese currency appreciate a little bit. If you take my advice seriously, and this is a good time to park all your American dollar savings into a Chinese bank, okay? And waiting for the Chinese currency to appreciate, and you get rich and just pay me 10% commission. I'll be happy.
I just wanted to add that there's a huge struggle right now in the Middle East about how to denominate oil money. Question of petrodollars versus petro-euros. The Iranians, for example, have tried very hard to distance the pricing of oil exports from the dollar for obvious sort of economic and political reasons. The Europeans aren't certain that they want a petro-euro. The Chinese have been kind of trying to say, well, again, sort of the Chinese, can we have this a basket approach? You know, so it's interesting to try to figure that out. The point is these American-Chinese struggles over the currency also are being reflected in Middle Eastern markets very, very daily. So if you do oil futures trading, you know that better than anyone here. And I want to talk to you afterwards to hear what you have to say about investments. So, okay. More questions?
Try to stay away from economic questions. We don't have economists on the panel.
Okay. Yeah, obviously it's a beautiful day outside. Okay. I think, you know, this is exactly internally we probably will end at 11 o'clock, which is perfect timing. And the 2 hours on Saturday morning is actually a pretty good virtue for you to go through. We're going to continue this dialogue, obviously. If not in this kind of forum, or definitely classroom in the hallway, and we do have a different regional forums. Representing here, basically, is a joint effort. We have African Forum, Asia Forum, Euro-Asia Forum, and Latin American Forum. In addition, we also have a Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies. So all the 5 units put out the programs constantly, probably to your irritation a lot of times because of a lot of announcement. But please do participate in those forums, and because after all, we are the world. Okay. Thank you very much for coming, and have a nice weekend.